All right, you ready? Okay. Good evening and welcome to the City of Montgomery City Council Workshop for April 21st, 2025. We have a quorum, Ms. Bevan, and with that I'd like to bring this to order. If you'd make sure your phones are on vibrate, if not, that would be great. And we will go ahead with an invocation given by Mr. Donaldson and then do the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Father, give us insight and wisdom on the information we're about to receive. Let us process it for the benefit of the city, if need be, and we thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right, for the American Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Texas flag?
Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
Did not receive any comments for public forum this evening, so we'll move into a workshop agenda. Item number 4 on your agenda, presentation by Evergreen Solutions LLC on compensation and classification study for the city of Montgomery, Texas. Hi, Mr. Michael, you would please. Good evening.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Strachey. I'm a project manager with Evergreen Solutions and with a firm that's been working on the city's compensation classification study. Tonight, what I've got to present to you is a bit of an overview of the work that we've done and what has led to our recommendations that we have for you today. And our recommendations are such that we will give some guidance on what direction the city would like to go in terms of potentially adopting some changes. So with that, I want to start by beginning and talking about the overview of we'll start by going through the study goals, related to the compensation classification study goals to achieve. And then we'll talk about what were the project grades that we expect to achieve over the process. Touch on a little bit where our findings were from the employee meetings when we were on site and met with employees and see feedback from them on what they think is working well and not working well as it relates to compensation and classification. City presently, talk about what our current system findings were, so what do you think about the current ways you guys are doing with compensation classification within a vacuum, and then we'll go into the market findings, so what was the external comparison versus other organizations, what did that yield, and what were our recommendations to the city as they stand today. So first, in terms of the overall goal of this process, with compensation classification, so there's always 3 main objectives. The very first objective is to take a look at what you have today, understanding policies and procedures and system and structures that you have right now that govern compensation. So how do you compensate employees? What are the ways that you progress salaries on an annual basis, whatever the case may be, that you do progress salaries? And what are the policies that govern things like hiring decisions on where you place salaries, what happens when somebody gets promoted? All those things go into us evaluating where we stand today to understand what salaries people achieve today, what kind of progression has occurred, and what are the issues that may be present in your system right now. In addition to that, the second main point is to do the external comparison. And that's what folks would typically associate with the compensation study, and that's the external market survey. So looking at pure organizations and understanding what are their practices and policies and where they stand today, and of course, what are their prevailing rates? What are the rates that they are offering for similar work that you guys have here performed at the city, at other organizations, to get a sense of how competitive is your compensation structure as it stands today. And then lastly, the third objective is to tie those two things together with these recommendations to improve the state of compensation here right now. And so it's all, with that, it's the goal of trying to bring it in line. What are you doing right now with regards to compensation versus where you want to be with compensation? Bring in line the practices with your philosophy and where are you versus where you want to be and bringing those things together. And so with that, I'll jump into what do the actual phases look like about the projects that kind of achieve these goals. So phase 1 was basically the homework phase. That's where we reached out to the city and basically worked with the administration to get an understanding of what you guys do today. We asked them for a laundry list of items related to policies, procedures, how we're compensating employees, assessment of everybody, working and not working well in the city as well. Once we had begun that data collection, we really begun phase 2, which was the analysis of all of that. And so that was a result of looking at our data in terms of information on what's pay look like right now. We're running some statistical analysis on what pay progression has occurred here at the city. But then also it is looking at information from employees and their job duties. So we have employees fill out job surveys and basically ask them, if you were to recreate your job description today to bring it as current as possible, make sure we're looking at updated tasks and responsibilities, what does that look like? So employees participated in those surveys and provide that information to us. And that was why it was two reasons. One, look at internally what is the state of equity or fairness of pay delegated to positions within the organization based on their responsibilities and duties. But then also, for us to do that market survey, which is in phase 3, we wanted to make sure we had a good baseline understanding of what is it that each job is expected to do. And so by going through this process, that allowed us to both get feedback from the employees and their supervisors on what are their updated tasks and responsibilities. That helps us have a good baseline understanding of what goes into that job. And so we look in comparison to pure organizations, we're not looking strictly at what your job titles are. We're looking, job titles can be creative, as you can imagine. They can be a lot of things about organizations, but job duties are what you want to base that comparison on. And so that really serves the strong basis of that as well. So talking about phase 3, what that entailed was us designing a group of comparable organizations, which I'll cover here shortly, to base the market survey. In that market survey, we did a comprehensive compensation survey to look at the state of where you guys are on your positions versus other organizations and find what kind of delta existed. How far ahead or behind were you on all your various positions, and in the aggregate, what was your overall market position? And then lastly, phase 4 was the recommendation stage. And so this is where we formulated a set of draft and final recommendations, which we have for you today, on what you can do to improve your compensation structure standing right now, what would be the benefits of doing that, as well as what would be the financial cost to enact these things. And so we've got a set of alternative recommendations for you to consider today. There's no one single that's passed forward. We wanted to bring you guys a set of recommendations that do have pros and cons that are different directions. And then lastly, we also have reporting, which is part of what we're doing today to do kind of a presentation, but also we also have a full packeted final report that's been delivered as well to the city. And that it's about a 20 or 30 page written document that goes over all of our methodology in more detail than I could ever cover here today about what is it we did from start to finish our findings and recommendations. With that, I want to talk a little bit about what we ascertained when we met with employees on site. So please.
Okay, in phase 1, the outreach, you said you worked with the administration. Who did you work with?
So Ruby was our main point of contact. However, we did work with all the city leadership as a whole. It wasn't a single person team. We had many individuals who were contributing to that process. And in that outreach process as well, Ruby was our point of contact to help coordinate the study. But when we talk about that outreach, we were meeting with all various employees during that process. So I was actually going to touch on next, this is employee meetings. So we held 2 sets of employees. We held general orientation sessions where we met with employees and we basically informed them this is what the study is all about. And so that was meant to be very much a Q&A type session. This is what a compensation classification study is. This is what we're asking of them to participate in the process by way of the surveys that relate to their job tasks. And also it offered them a chance to ask questions of us. What are we really expecting of them? What can they expect this process and set expectations to? The other type of session that we hold with employees were focus groups. And so that's when I mentioned getting employees' sentiment or opinions on compensation right now within the city. That's what those focus groups were designed to really get feedback from employees on what are the things they felt were working well, what were the concerns that they had. And we asked them a variety of questions related to compensation classification to get a sense of where they, what was their temperature on these things and what were the concerns they mainly had. And so, in terms of the main takeaways that we found, of course, all different employees have different concerns, but in terms of the trends that we found, there were 2 key positives that employees said pretty much unilaterally. One was they felt the benefits of the city were fantastic. They really loved the benefits package offered by the organization right now. In particular, they highlighted the retirement system contributions. In addition to that, they highlighted culture. And so that was 2 things that we tend to find a lot in local government. Yeah, benefits and culture are usually the two big things employees like to point out.
Could you tell me when this study actually began? I probably have it at the house, but I don't remember.
The study began in fall, and so we were.
When was the exact date? Do you remember?
I don't have that on me. I apologize.
You say fall, so that would be September of last year?
Because we didn't get, when did you get here, October?
November.
November, so you only worked with her, so you only started it then?
On November 18th is when I started,
Yeah.
and then my first day or two after being here, I went right into a meeting with them and
Okay.
discovered what all we had to go from there.
Okay.
And it wasn't just me, it was also the chief as interim. Between the two of us, we coordinated a lot of the information with all the department heads.
Okay.
And the department head, each employee came in, had a meeting, sit down and talk about what these guys did, what their job descriptions were. And they had to make out, they each had to come up with a job description of what they did. And so, yeah, but this had started.
I was gonna say, it seems like it started like over a year
We're the
ago.
one who initiated hiring these guys, so this started almost 2-3 months before.
Yeah, I mean, so
I was going to say, I thought it was almost been a year.
Yeah,
we
you're
started
right.
in midsummer
It
around
was
June.
September.
September, okay.
Yeah,
Was it September?
September, October.
Okay.
Yeah, and we had to provide a number of reports, employees, positions, job descriptions, all of those type of things. All of that happened prior to the on-site meetings that took place right after we reached.
Yes, that portion
It was that first week she was here that we had those meetings.
So
But
I remember the meetings in June.
they had already started that
Already
process.
get this going
Yeah, I guess we talked about it quite some time then.
for at least.
Maybe that was just what it was, and we talked about it
Yeah,
a lot
Yes.
before we
This
finished.
officially was approved, I think, either August or September
Yeah, with this company.
with
right,
this
yeah.
company, correct.
Okay. Thank you.
And then, in addition to what we heard from those employees, the main concerns that we heard was pay structure concerns or lack of clarity or understanding about the compensation structure. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about next is one of the big drawbacks that you have in your current method of compensating employees. If you don't have a formal, what we would consider a formal compensation structure, a system of pay ranges and grades assigned to positions in a uniform manner. And so that was one of the biggest concerns, if not the single biggest concern employees highlighted, was that lack of system, that lack of structure means there was a lack of clarity or transparency to them on how our employees compensated, how our salaries determined, and understanding what would progression look like for them. And then additionally, although not necessarily within the full scope of the study, something that is tangential and relates to compensation or often comes up in these meetings is staffing concerns. So from an employee standpoint, although we're not looking at staffing, they often think about the value proposition of compensation. Staffing is one of those things that weighs on employees' minds if they feel overworked or they feel like they're stretched thin. That's something that also came up as their concern on staffing shortages that led to morale issues or feeling like they didn't have the resources they needed. So in terms of looking at your current compensation structure and looking at your current system, I just mentioned right now you lack a formal structure. And again, what I mean by that is there's no designated salary ranges for positions saying this is going to be the hard starting point for an administrative assistant, this is the hard ending point for an administrative assistant. It's salaries are determined on an ad hoc basis or on an individual level basis. And that's not unusual for an organization your size. Most organizations, when they start out smaller, they don't tend to have a formal structure when you have less than 50 to 100 employees. A lot of them don't necessarily come with that because it's not necessary right out the starting gate when you're on a smaller side. But as an organization grows and as it grows in complexity, that's where having a formal compensation structure can be very helpful. In addition to that, this is one of those things that is more emergent as well. That 30 years ago, it would have been more common to find municipal governments without a formal compensation structure. It's less common these days for that because more and more organizations have gone through a process like this, either in an internal way or with an external party like ourselves, to create a formalized structure to basically create some rigor on how employees and positions are compensated. In addition to that, one of the other key things, so we did look, so not having compensation ranges does limit us on what we're able to analyze, but one of the things that we are able to look at, regardless of having pay ranges, is looking at the degree to which there may be compression that exists between employees and supervisors. And we found that there was none, and that's a good sign. So one of the things that can be concerning is if an organization doesn't have formal pay ranges, it can be harder to keep an eye on things like pay compression, both across employees and then across employees and their supervisors, of course, because there's not as many guardrails built into that system. That being said, right now we found that pay compression between employees and supervisors was not a present concern. It was something we tested for. And the other thing was that we found...
Here, time out. Just for everybody's knowledge, can you explain pay compression?
Absolutely. So pay compression, there's really two forms, and I've got a slide that speaks to this. There's really two forms that we would consider. The type I just referred to is sometimes referred to as inversion. The idea of an employee's salary being too close to their supervisor, that they make the same amount or more than their supervisor, and so the value proposition may be offered to the supervisor that the report makes more than them, but they have higher responsibility. And so that's what we would consider employee or supervisor pay compression. The other form of pay compression is usually considered maybe within the pay range case, pay compression will be classification. And that's the idea that maybe two employees who have vastly different experience could have a very similar rate of pay. So if somebody's been with the organization for 30 years and somebody got hired tomorrow and they had the exact same rate of pay, or they made something very similar, that would be considered pay compression as well, because there's a lack of pay difference where there would be an expected pay difference based on a number of factors. And in local government, the number one factor that tends to drive pay differences is time. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be the only factor. It can always be things like performance and other elements as well. But time with the organization and time, just general experience, is usually the number one predictor of pay progression or pay differences in local government. And largely in most industries for that matter, because time means more time that you can receive an increase. One of the things that we also found is we also looked at this was not solely looking at compensation, but also the classification structure, or the structure that governs how titles are, or positions are titled and how they're grouped together and organized. And so in that vein, we found that most jobs were appropriately classified. That's not unusual. Most organizations do a good job of keeping that in mind. We did find that there were some classifications that made sense for recommendation or some title changes to bring them a little bit more in line with what the job duties they're doing right now. So if you think about, again, going back to the surveys employees provided us, they let us know updated job duties and responsibilities and tasks. Job descriptions by nature become out of date, they're static document, your organization changes, your job duties and needs change. And so we did find some roles would benefit from an update in their title, not just for those bringing in line with their updated job duties requirements, but also to bring in line with industry standards. Sometimes it may be that the organization hasn't fundamentally changed the job, but what the outside world would call that job has moved on and changed. IT is a classic example of this, where in the past it was a program analyst, and it became a systems analyst, and now it's an applications developer. It's an ever-evolving job title. While it may not fundamentally change how you compensate, the role of the title changes, it can be very pivotal when you go out to recruit for that role that you're using a market that's title, because that's what applicants are looking for, especially when you're talking about in fields that are a little bit more dynamic like IT. So I think I really already covered this next line, dealing with compression, but we did talk about compression analysis already briefly, but I just want to reiterate again, we did not find any examples of rank compression or that idea of compression between employees and their supervisors. We were not able to look at range compression in the traditional sense, because right now you guys lack ranges. And so that for us to say, relatively speaking, does somebody make the right salary next to somebody sitting next to them doing the same job, usually you have to have an idea of where is the starting point and the stopping point. You have to have that context to say, well, is that gap between them appropriate? Have they progressed enough? It's a lot harder when we don't have a defined starting point and stopping point. And so we weren't able to look at compression in the traditional sense the way we normally analyze it. However, we do have recommendations that try to space based on this. And I'll touch on that what I mean in just a few minutes. The next thing I want to touch on is the market results. And so this was that phase 3 part of the study where we looked at what was the compensation offered by peers and what their practices right now. And so you'll see on the right-hand side of this page, the exhibit will show what were the 10 peers that we collected market data from. We understand that these are peers that vary in size and location, as well as cost of living as well. And so we did adjust all results that came back for regional cost of living differences.
I'm sorry, another question. So these are the ones the 10 that you're looking at. So how did you compensate for their number of employees versus their economy? Like the Woodlands economy is certainly not what we have here in Montgomery.
So when we talk about economy, that's why we use that regional cost of living difference. And so what we're looking at there is the power of the spending power an employee in Woodlands would have versus what you would all have in your area. So that regional cost of living helps account for that as much as possible with that apples to apples comparison.
Because I don't find any of these apples to apples with Montgomery.
Well, and that's the challenge if you're going to have an organization surrounded by larger entities, is that you're not going to necessarily have only comparators that you can look at. And so this list isn't composed strictly of comparators, but it does have all competitors. There are organizations that are within the commuting distance or are within that field where employees could not necessarily pick up their family and move, but they could go work in these other organizations. And so some of these are going to be more competitors than they are going to be comparators. And so that's one of the challenges that you guys have, obviously. And so while, we can adjust for something like cost of living, we wouldn't be able to adjust for necessarily the size of the organization because while that has an impact on some positions, on frontline staff, that wouldn't, how big the organization is, wouldn't change the job design. If they have the same job duties in one organization and they have the same job duties in the organization, that's a competitor position to you all that you have to compete in the labor market. Now, whether or not you want to be one-to-one to those peers, that's a different discussion, but they are part of that labor market you have to compete against.
I guess I really don't understand that because to be somebody that works in a municipality for, let's say College Station, to me, they would have much more to do than they would here because of the population. So maybe I just don't understand it as well as I should.
So basically you control that with staff size. They're gonna have the similar duties and a person has an 8-hour day, right? And we have to take.
I understand that, Casey. I was a business owner.
Let me finish, right? So we have to take for granted or take an assumption that person's working those whole 8 hours, right? So if you have more work, you have more people. The job still pays the same, right?
Councilman, you're correct. That essentially, we're not looking at staffing volume. So if an organization has a lot more, say, service calls, that doesn't impact, again, the baseline job duty expectations that somebody would have because volume of work is variable. Whether or not you have full staffing levels or whether or not procedure you're talking about, those things are a little bit more variable when we're talking about the structure of the position, we're talking about the baseline. Is this something that somebody in that organization, if they're able to do those job duties, and they also do those job duties here, and they can apply for this job and compete for the job here? And so we're looking at more of that labor market availability and could somebody fill the role perspective. So with that, we looked at the 24 classifications that you have on the book right now, so all roles we're looking at, and so this in terms of unique positions that you have. And then we did have a good response rate. So in general, we want to make sure that we have a good match count across these organizations. We had a little bit over 6 matches on average per position, which is good given we have 10 peers. That means we had a pretty good overlap amongst those organizations in finding comparable positions. The reason why you don't see that be a full 10 is because not every organization has a perfect match, and that's what we mean by looking at those job tasks and responsibilities of the roles you have here versus the peers. Not every organization has the exact job that you have laid out here, or at least close enough. We know that no two organizations do the job exactly the same, but we do look for about 75% overlap in job duties to consider that a match. If it's less than that, we generally do not consider that a match. We're looking for at least a 75% overlap in tasks and responsibilities. Oh, sorry, I had a question. So we'll talk about the market results. What we've got for you shown here is 2 things. So there's 2 numbers that we listed there. And before I talk about the numbers, I want to talk about what did we do to attain these numbers. So we collected all of this market data information from peers. And what we collected from them was what were their current salaries, and what were their current salary, more importantly, what their salary ranges. So ranges, again, are structural in nature. They take out the noise. Average salaries can be a challenge if you look at those solely because there's a lot of variability that goes into that. In any organization, you can have a higher tenured person in a position that can skew things, performance metrics, it's hard to control for those things we don't know organizations have baked in there. But the salary ranges tell us what is the minimum they're willing to pay for these job duties and what is the maximum they're willing to pay. And that's why that structure is so important to look at. Now, right now, you guys don't have that structure to compare against. So what we have to do is basically do the next thing, which is look at what's the average salary you compensate employees right now, and compare that versus the midpoint of the structures at those other organizations. So what's the halfway point that they would compensate for, again, I'll use an example classification of an administrative assistant. What would they compensate the midpoint of the administrative assistant range versus what's the average salary you guys would bring for that position at your organization? And so with that, we found, when we did that comparison, you guys were about, when not considering cost of living regional differences, where we don't control for that, about 12% behind the market right now, the average. When we control for cost of living, that goes down to about 10%. So you can see the cost of living does, when we consider that factor, it improves your competitive position a little bit. But if we were going to put a diagnosis on what does it mean to be 10% behind the market, generally speaking, what I tell organizations is if you're within 2 to 3% of the market, you're at market. You're within that margin of error. Nobody's really changing any major decisions for 2 or 3%. You're at market average. When you get to be about 5% behind, I wouldn't expect any significant problems in the organization. But the way it works is that 10%, or if I'm using the example 5%, isn't composed of every position being 5% behind. It's made up of variation. So some positions will be 15, 20% behind, some will be 10% ahead. There's going to be variation. No organization has a situation where all positions are equal to the market and the positioning. It's always going to be variability. So when you get to about 5% behind, as an organization, you may not be suffering, but there's going to be some classifications that probably are. When you get to be about double digits or in the 10% territory where you guys are finding yourselves right now, it tells us that your progression is not keeping up with the market. And when you get to 10%, that's usually where I would start to see recruitment and retention challenges, that you would have failed searches, you would have part-time filling some vacancies, or you've had some long-standing vacancies. That's usually what it tells me when I see something like that. Or that could be on the horizon with some of the classes, depending on where that differential is being driven by those classifications. And so that 10% again is the overall average, but some classifications are further behind, some are a little bit closer. And our recommendations that we're providing are pursuant to where those individual positions stand. So we're not recommending a carte blanche 10% fixes everything. Rather, we recommend something more targeted where we're trying to bring the positions that are further off the market closer in line. So with that, dovetailing into the recommendations, there's the recommendations are a little bit more nuanced. They fall into 3 broad categories. One is we're recommending you adopt a market responsive pay plan. So this would mean adopting a structure of a set number of pay ranges or pay grades that are assigned to a given number or code, and it says this range is going to go from X dollar from here to this X dollar, and that would be the new way of slotting or putting all titles that you have into one of those pay ranges. And we would assign them based on 2 things. One, the job duties and responsibility evaluation that we did of what the employees provided us. So evaluate the roles that are what's the value they provide to the organization from an internal perspective, and then also what's the current market value for those roles as well. So that we consider all of those things, because we don't want to simply go with only a market-driven system. We want to also look at that internal equity of what's the relationship between the jobs you have right now and how they interact with one another. And so the market responsive pay plan, we actually have this in 2 forms. We recommended this both in an open range form as well as in a step-based form. And this is really just for your consideration. There's not a right or wrong answer for any organization. I'm sure we have open ranges versus steps. And I'll also cover what I mean by open range versus step 2. So an open range structure means my salary range starts at whatever number, 40,000, and it goes to 60,000, and the salary can fall for an employee, can fall anywhere between that 40,000 and 60,000 down to the cent. It can fall at any point, regardless. Steps is a more rigorous approach where it says if we have a range that goes from 40,000 to 60,000, we're going to have intervals between that 40 and 60 that salaries must fall. And those steps can be incremental, and they're usually tied to either a flat dollar amount or a flat percentage amount. And in this case, we recommended a flat percentage amount that says a step is going to progress by 2% every year between. And so what we recommended in terms of the step plan, it's a 30-year step plan, which that aligns with, generally speaking, what the typical public sector career length looks like in 30 years. And so for somebody to get from minimum to the maximum of their pay grade, they would have to stay in 30 years and receive a step increase every single year for 30 years to max out on that model. And again, it would be a 2% increase every single year. And the open range plan give you the benefits and positives of the two different things. Open ranges are all about flexibility. It's the idea that, again, you can place employees anywhere from point A to point B within that salary range as needed. Step plans are about rigor and about setting expectations and creating more guardrails. It helps employees. Step plans help employees understand, here's how I'm going to progress over time within my career. If I stay here X amount of years, and we keep step increases every year, this is where I'm going to end up in year 5. So it's going to look like in year 10. It helps create that transparency for employees and have a good understanding of what the progression looks like. In addition to that, it also makes salary planning a little easier sometimes because you know as an organization, if we're going to give everybody a step, what does that look like? It's 2% across the board for everybody. There's a little bit more rigor from a financial side if you know this is what it's going to be when if you give a step, this is how much that goes along with it. With open ranges, you're not tied to, okay, I can only give this percent increase, we can put any number in that we have budgeted in a year that we feel is appropriate. So there's pros and cons to a step plan versus open range. In terms of what we see out in other organizations, steps are historically what local governments use very frequently. It's something that flowed down from the federal system. If you're all familiar with the federal system at all, the G scale, they still use steps till this day at the federal level. States, by and large, still use steps as well. And I can tell you all across Texas, steps still are very much a thing. We'll see it in counties and cities. Not everybody uses them. Some will use them only for public safety, or some will use them only for teachers, but there is but some still use it for general employees as well, or maybe they only use it for civil service. It does vary quite a bit, but steps are still very much a thing, especially in Texas. So that is the first 2 recommendations about adopting a structure in whichever form. So we've mapped up what would the recommendations look like regardless of which path we want to go on, open range versus step plan structure. The second objective, or the second recommendation, is once you have the plan in hand, you have to be able to assign positions to those grades that we've recommended. And so that's what that second recommendation is, to assign all of those positions to a pay grade on either plan based on our analysis of the work that they are required to do, as well as the market data we retrieved on all those positions. And then the third piece of it is, once you have said, okay, we want this pay plan, we have a way of slotting everybody into the pay ranges on this plan, the question becomes, where do we actually place employee salaries within these pay ranges for the first time? It never happened. And that's where we get into a variety of different options or pathways. And there's not a singular best approach, but I can talk about the pros and cons of these different methods we've mapped up here. So first off, what we would consider a baseline approach, and either a bring to minimum in the case of the open range plan, or bring your closest step in the case of the step plan. And in general, as I go through these options, you'll find that they follow the same methodology for both plans. But the nature of a step plan, as I mentioned, is you have to fall on a salary that is associated with a step. So there's always this extra mathematical element to the step plan where we have to round off employee salaries, however we calculated them, to make sure they end up on a step. And so that's why you'll notice for any given option that we're looking at, the step plan generally has a higher cost associated because whatever number we calculated for the methodology, we then got to round them up just a little bit to get them onto a step associated with that plan. It's an extra little step to make sure they're in full line with the plan. So with the bring to minimum, the closest step, these are baseline approaches. What these do is they allow you to say, we have turned on the system, we have made sure that an employee has made, if there's all employees within the organization will make at least the minimum of the salary ranges that we've assigned them to, the plan that we've adopted. Or in the case of the closest step, it is saying not just that we're assigning them to the minimum, but we've taken their salaries and we've just rounded them up to the next highest step appropriate. So nobody's salary gets rounded down, nobody's salary gets reduced, but it gets rounded off to the next step that is as close to where they are right now. It's basically, these approaches are, we want to adopt the ranges, we want to put the system in place, but we don't necessarily have resources or we don't want to realign any further than that on day one. We just want to get everybody in these new guardrails, and then from there, we reassess. That's what this approach does. And as we'll see when we go to the numbers, this will also have the slowest financial burden relative to the other options, because again, we're only checking the bare minimums and making sure it was either in the plan or on the plan. The parity options that you'll see here, the class parity, the tenure parity, the hybrid parity, they are all doing a similar function. They are not looking at the baseline. They're looking at the concept of realignment. So how do I need to space out my employee salaries within this plan in an appropriate manner? That's what these parities aim to do. And so as I mentioned before, we were not able to look at set range compression in a traditional sense because you guys lack ranges. But what we've done with these parities is basically, if we were to try to space employees appropriately, create appropriate spacing, this is what it would look like. But the concept of appropriate placing is again a little nebulous. And that's why we have three different options here. So what is the appropriate way to space out employee salaries within a range? We've looked at that in the context of time in their current position or current classification. That's what the class parity does. It only looks at how long has an employee been within their current role. The tenure parity looks at how long an employee's been with the organization overall. So regardless of whether I've promoted up or I've relocated to another position or I've been classified, however long I've been with the organization, I get full credit for that time and I get placed in my salary range on that basis. The hybrid parity does a little bit of a mix of the two. It looks at how long have I been in my current role while also giving some additional discounted credit for how long I've been in other roles within the organization. So I like to use the classic example of an accountant. So an accountant had been with the organization for 10 years, they would have, as an accountant, they would have 10 years of classification time. And that would be the same across all three methodologies. They'd get 10 years of credit. But if they had promoted up, then say after 10 years, they promoted up and they've now been an accounting supervisor for an additional 5 years. Under the class parity, they would only get the 5 years as a accounting supervisor because that's the time they've been in their current position. Those 10 years as an accountant would not be considered. In the tenure parity, they would be given 15 years of credit because they'd get 10 years as an accountant and 5 years as an accounting supervisor. They'd be given 15 years of credit in their placement along the range. In the hybrid period, they would be given a in-between. They'd be given full 5 years of credit as their time as an accountant, as an accounting supervisor, and they'd be given half credit for their time as an accountant. So 5 years for that, the 10 years taken in half. And so they get 10 years of credit under that model, under the hybrid model. And what these models do, again, is they are essentially looking at trying to place employee salaries somewhere between the minimum and the maximum based on how long they've been there. And we do this on a 30-year trajectory. So employees will look, if they've been here for 15 years, or they're getting 15 years of credit under one of these different methods, they'd be placed at the midpoint of the range. If they've been here for 30 years, they'd be placed at the maximum. And so it's all down to your precision where they'd be placed within that salary range. What these essentially achieve as opposed to this option is, again, time being the number one predictor of salary changes in local government. This aligns employee salaries within these new ranges based on time. And whether or not, which time factor you want to weigh or which one you would like to reward, whether it be classification only, total time of the organization, or a combination of the three, those different options are there for you to consider. The last option that we have listed is range placement. And so this is a little bit different. So I've talked about what if we don't want to change up? What if we just want to put the new guardrails on? That's what the first option is. What if we want to realign people based on time? That's what options 2 through 3 do. But the fifth option, range placement, looks at what is the relative progression that I've achieved right now, and can I transfer that into the range? Now, because you don't have salary ranges, we were not able to say, this is the relationship an employee has versus the midpoint, or this is the relationship I have versus my minimum. Well, what we did is we basically said, look, pretend you had minimums and maximums and midpoints right now. Let's put some fake guardrails around what you have right now, and let's look at it in context. How far progressed would those employee salaries be around these theoretical minimums and maximums that you have? And so we basically ran the analysis in that way, and we found, and we transferred employee salaries on that progression they've achieved right now against those hypothetical ranges into the real ranges. And that's what range placement does. It's not as strong of an option as I would say for you all in this instance because we're not basing it on current ranges and progression employees that are already against current ranges. It's really looking more at, again, if you have ranges in this hypothetical sense, this is what the progression employees achieve. I don't think it's necessarily the most relevant option, but we like to show this because it looks, we can basically give you the avenues of, let's do the baseline and start there, versus let's do significant realignment, versus let's try to do minimal realignment, so let's maintain the progression employees that are achieved right now. That's what these three main pathways essentially do. And so in terms of the costs, we have them listed out across these different options, as you can see, for both the open range plan and the step plan on these two concurrent slides. Obviously, as I mentioned, the cost essentially roll across methodologies, so to speak, because bring the minimum will be your lowest cost option from a financial burden sense, because again, you're just turning the system on. Same with doing the closest step, it will be the lowest cost option for was going to say endorse an option today that I think would be best suited for the organization, I think one of the parity options, depending on how you value time for the organization, is likely the best path forward if you were to adopt, regardless of the step plan versus the open range plan. In terms of local government, I can tell you the hybrid plan is the most popular that most organizations go with because they want to give that straight time for classification time, but they don't want to fully discredit time spent at a lower level, but they may not want to give full credit for it. Because right in my example, if somebody's promoted up several times, you don't want to necessarily give them full credit for this higher level role that they're in, when really they've only been in that role a minority of their time in the organization. And so that's where that hybrid parity can really split the difference there.
I have a question. I believe on January 1st, we gave a cost of living increase of 5%. Was that taken into account?
I believe we do have the updated roster. Ruby, I believe we got that from, yeah, we had that in there. So we have the updated salary roster is accounted for.
How many employees do we have?
And, well, I'm assuming 39. How many employees do we have?
We have 39 employees
Yes.
currently.
Based on this, yeah. So everything that I have seen when we go out to look for a new employee, there's been a pay range. So if I've seen that, and I've been here through quite a bit of bringing on new employees, was that taken into account whenever you were looking at saying that we don't have that range, or where?
So that's a range that we we select that range.
Yeah, but we
It's
want
not
to
set in
say,
stone or, hey, this is the range for this position, right? That's just.
that's what we're looking for, and that's what we're willing to pay.
Exactly.
And
And what we were recommending is a formalized permanent range for that home. So rather than you guys have to think of, okay, what's the range we want to give an officer right now, or what do we think in our budget? It would be, as an organization, we decided this is the minimum pay that we think an officer should have. This is the maximum we're willing to pay as an organization. Now, you don't necessarily have to advertise that full range. We advertise a portion of the range of the higher range too.
Exactly.
For a position. And that's again, for transparency purposes, and it will help your recruiting costs typically, because if you advertise the full range, sometimes people think, well, I'll get the maximum. But realistically, very few local governments are hiring people anywhere near the maximum. You're hiring people somewhere between the minimum and maybe the midpoint, depending on the classification, in most instances. So it's good to advertise the portion of the range that you're actually comfortable hiring within too.
I think we have, yeah.
Well, it makes it a lot easier at the time of, hey, we need an employee, and running around going, what do we gotta do to be competitive? What do we gotta, we have the steps, we have it in place. This is the employee that we're looking for, this specific slot, we go find that employee.
And I guess we have added like an APHR, which before we've just been replacing, so we already knew what we wanted.
Well, to be competitive, the goal should be, how do we reduce this minus 10.2%? And the way he explained it, there's some categories where we're overpaying and some that are underpaying. So I can't see, in order to get our competitiveness back into a lower percentage, I can't see where we have to take the people we're overpaying and reduce that range. Is that, how can we make this
So
percentage?
Stan, what you do, you never want to decrease someone's wages, right?
Well, I know you don't, I'm just saying.
So let me explain how you do that. You freeze them, right? You freeze that salary range until the market has caught up, whether it's cost of living or whatever. You freeze that until it's caught up and it's back into range. And while that is frozen, you use that to bring your other end up, right? So it's called, in layman's terms, we tie the high end down and bring the low end up.
Okay, so basically, we can eliminate this percentage by just the ranges we set. Not paying any attention to
If
what
we
we
pick
pay.
one of these plans, that's what they've done the math for, to get us in line.
So there'd be 8 adjusted for here, 12 adjusted for here, 10 adjusted for here, and 31
And I'm
adjusted.
assuming that all of these numbers would bring us back into line. That's why they had to pick a calculation that would bring us in line, otherwise it'd be all over the place.
That's correct. The goal is to get the overall organization back up to the average. And so when we talk about the different positions and how they compare to market, think of it the same way you're looking at the numbers here. Not every single person's affected by the recommendations. So there are people with zero cost, and those are going to be people in classifications where they're doing better against the market. But the classifications that are further behind market, and so we had to very different versus where their salary is, and as a result, their salary's got to move up in that new range we recommended. Those are the people that would be under that employee adjusted column, because they're the ones that are further behind market. And so employees that are essentially at market or above would be, their health harms are not reduced, but they're not adjusted as part of this process. That's why you don't see every single employee adjusted under the open rate option. The reason why you see a higher number of adjustments, in terms of number of people adjusted in the step option, is, and the way the step plan works is your salary, even if they're already at market, we would have to round them off just to make sure they get on the next step. So, but that rounding could be as minimal as a fraction of a percent. It could be $10, $15, or it could be a couple $100, depending on where the salary falls between the steps. And that's because we're just trying to make sure they make a salary that's on the step so that they're cohesive with the plan. And that's why I say the open range is a little bit, in general, open range plans, adopting them is usually a little bit less financially burdensome because it doesn't require that last mathematical step. But it's really a point of implementation thing that happens, but then from there on out, they operate similar in fashion depending on how you give your COLAs versus giving steps.
And is this this presentation to us, is this your last step for the $19,500 we paid the company?
Yes, so in addition to the presentation today, we have sent over the final report. Again, that goes into more detail. It'll have everything I've said today, but it'll also go into more detail on the exhibit. So if you want to see the breakdown, how did that market comparison look across classifications, that's within there. If you want to see what are the recommended pay ranges that go to the positions, that's all included into, so there's a lot more detail. In addition to that, we also, one of the things that I haven't mentioned today, but one of the other deliverables was updating your job descriptions. So the working employees provided to us, so they fill out the surveys and about their job tasks and responsibilities. We took that information, we actually brought your job descriptions current because it's the perfect opportunity to do so. When they've sat down and given us this information, we provided job descriptions back to the organization as well.
And there's leadership here. Did y'all review those, and did you agree with the revised job descriptions?
I believe the job descriptions came in last week while I was out of town, so I've not had an opportunity to look at them or to make sure that every department head has them.
We looked at when they started revamping those job descriptions. It's like you guys were talking about earlier. You can take a city like Conroe, and the police officers here will do more than what a police officer in Conroe. If you got burglary in Conroe, you send somebody from burglary. If you got a burglary here, you send somebody from patrol. And so those people are cross-trained in all these other jobs. So we looked at the descriptions because when they first came in, we asked each person to get together all of the job descriptions, not just the things they do. From the guy who does investigation to the same guy who takes care of our calls. So we put all of those, we didn't put the cars in there, but we put miscellaneous descriptions, miscellaneous jobs as well. So yeah, we cleaned the
So
job.
are y'all changing any job descriptions?
We took the opportunity to change some of those job descriptions as we went along because we needed updating too. Because some of the job descriptions that we've had in the manual, we updated some when I first came here, but this gave us a chance to update some more job descriptions as well. To just become current.
So we'll get a flow chart of all the job descriptions update, correct?
So of that scenario you just shared, then there was only 2 cities, Waller and Willis, on here that would have that same kind of scenario when you take somebody off of patrol.
Even when you look at, like Willis is 6,000-7,000 people, 6,000-7,000 people. So yeah, they would run very much into the same scenarios.
Waller.
Also look at the step. You know we have a step in our manual right now. The step has never been used by the city at all. But there is a step program in the manual. When I first came here, I looked at that step. We put together something for the police department. Am I so much fun with the step range? Not so much. Because sometimes it takes a few years for someone to get to that next step in the step range.
Yes.
So those things there, those are kind of the things that make people move on.
It's not an incentive to stay.
Make people move on as well because they're saying, well, I'm not going to get to this point until I'm 5 years here. And over here, they're already paying that where I'm at right now. And so you have to look at those things too when you choose one of these.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm not a huge fan of steps. I am a fan of a structured pay scale, but I'm not a fan of
Right.
steps.
Right.
So, and just an FYI, when Epoxy bought Anadarko, they used the hybrid to bring us across. Right, so I didn't get full credit for all of my previous time and
Yeah, but
experience.
see, you're talking about corporation.
Oh, absolutely, but it's
And
the
I'm
same
coming
kind
from
of
a
structure.
small business perspective. So you and I are, we are worlds apart in what we're looking
But
at.
we are, it's still structure, right?
It is structure.
Whether you're this big or this big, you still have to have a structure.
I agree. Just for the equality of it.
Yep.
Anybody else have any other questions? No. Dr. Donaldson? Not at all.
Do you have another couple slides that you want to talk about?
No, that was it. Slide back.
So we need to visit with department heads.
I can't see that.
No, there's nothing up there.
Yeah, that's just the last page.
I can't see it. I'm looking up to, so I can gather my thoughts. I think as a council, we need to visit with department heads and kind of understand where we are and what the best step forward, just everybody's opinion.
I can tell you, everybody's going to want that raised.
Well, and I
That'd be first not to ask for
but
it.
that's the reason why we did this.
Yeah, I know, we wanted to know that.
Understand where
That's
we are,
absolutely,
right?
I know.
It's hard to sit back and say, no, we're not doing raises if you don't have.
If you don't have the market ask.
Well, not just that, I like to make decisions based on information. If I don't have the good information, we're just going with guesses and opinions, that to me is really bad information to make a decision on. So I really, really wanted to study. I know some of us, we're not as fond of the study.
Yeah, but all of us were, we
Just
wanted
give
to know.
us a base to make
no,
good
that's not
decisions
a
on,
study.
and that's what we need to do, right? If we're behind this area, with the really good information, the presentation was nice, but the nuts and bolts is in that report, so we can see where we're behind and where we're ahead, right? And that's the big one, is to make sure that we're just level, right? We don't need to be heavy and light, we just need to be in the middle.
But the other thing is you want our people here to be well compensated
Oh,
for what they
absolutely,
do.
100%, 100%.
But what information do we need to give the enterprise in order for them to make the final report? Do we have to make some decisions on what?
Tonight is just a workshop to give you the presentation, and this is the information that we wanted to make sure that got to you because we're going to begin the budget talks, and this is going to give you that opportunity when we go through the budget process for you to decide on what avenue you want to go with this.
Right.
And I believe we set these numbers up for 10-1, so that way you would see what the projected number was starting with 10-1.
Okay. So every year we go through raises and stuff in the budget, right? So this gives us an opportunity to pick one of these processes forward, whichever one it happens to be, and then we would apply that.
Right.
And then build it right into the budget. So the step is we just move forward with the normal business.
We're
We
starting.
have to pick up one of these plans if this is something we want to fix.
All right, I understand that, but we're fixing to get into the budget discussion very soon. So,
But they've already built everything for us.
Yeah.
It's all done, it's just picking which one to implement.
right, yeah,
I mean, they've done everything we paid for, so now we just pick what we want and they tell us how to do it.
right.
Thank you. Who has the
Yes, thank you.
report?
I believe I have the draft report unless you guys sent it to me with the finalized job descriptions. They said it was a draft.
Okay, we may need to send it with March final then, but nothing's changed from the draft, so.
Did we say one council?
No, not
No,
yet.
what was that in-depth report? Is it broken out by city and by position?
It's broken out by position.
Okay, not the cities,
No, so it's broken out, but it'll have the data broken out by position, but not position and city. The reason for that is basically competitive pay reasons. So an old Sherman antitrust law basically does not allow us to say this is what every single position in every organization pays, because then theoretically organizations would engage in negotiating price fixing of salaries and things like that. But it is rolled up to the position level. So you would see what is an officer's pay range, in average across these organizations.
Okay.
And it'll say, how many organizations responded, what does that average salary range look like?
Okay. Great, thank you.
Let me ask you a question. When you're talking about officers on that salary range, do we talk about experience, time on the job, how much time they've been
When we looked at analysis from your guys' standpoint, we have that for your organization, but not for other organizations, no. It is something we request, but it's rarely something they provide.
How do you do the comparison on that?
Right.
So because we're looking at it from a structural standpoint, so what is it they pay an officer regardless of experience? What's the minimum they're willing to pay an officer, and what's the maximum? So what's that structural range?
Okay.
That's what we've got provided in there, so you can see that context. And again, that strips away from those things of, well, how tenured are their officers? Do they give step raises? Do they give, other assignment pay? So it's all looking at the base pay of the position too, because we know, especially when it comes to public safety, there could be a lot of other things loaded into take-home pay as well that we may not see there. And so that's where we're looking really at one structural element we can control for, which is what's the minimum pay range for an officer in an organization, what's the maximum. And again, that's also giving the example, that's what it is for all positions. You're one.
And how many pages is that report?
I don't know the exact count, we have to remember, but it's usually in the 20s or 30s, somewhere, depending on the size. It's got usually about 4 or 5 chapters to it, depending on how we broke it out.
When I get the final version, because I didn't want to send you just a draft version if there was going to be revisions, and there were because we had some changes with doing the parity stuff.
That's right.
So I was waiting for that final version to come back.
We can get that, I can
get it
work with my team and have that on file tomorrow or the day after, so it'll be to you guys this week.
When we're doing this structure, I think probably, I'm thinking more about public works or possibly the officers, is that when they get, basically to me, it would be continuing education, but when they get certifications, like Mike's guys can get certification in different areas and stuff, is that going to be included in that?
So we don't have that built in right now. That is, it's the next, to me, from my perspective, it's the next step that you guys need to look at as an organization. So step one would be ideally adopting a formalized pay rate. Again, whether it be the open ranges and step plan, however you put employees on right now, getting that formal structure starts first. But things like incentive pay, certification pay, things like that are very important elements. But again, they're almost tack-on elements to that structure. Okay, now we know this is the range we have. But what do we want to pay somebody for a CDL? We want to build that into the range and say, there's a structural decision that's being made. Is this position required to have a CDL, therefore it's built into the pay range? Or is it, this position's optional to have a CDL, and we would pay them extra to have that, and so therefore we're going to give them this additional certification pay. That's the kind of decisions you have to make once you have that structure in place, because in some cases it's, well, it's part of the position. In other cases it's, well, it's not part of it. We would like to have it, and we want to incentivize people to get it, but we really can't require it. And so that's the, an example could be inspections trades. Sometimes it's, we need to have them, they have to be they have to be certified in a trade. But if we want them multi-trade so we can benefit from that, then, and we, as an organization or staff, we benefit from that. So we will incentivize them to have a built-out structure of that.
We recently just adopted a bunch of incentivized structure, so.
Yeah,
That's helpful.
incentivized structure.
Yeah.
And it's like police officers. If you don't have a driver's license, then we're not going to have police officers. You're riding around in cars with no driver's license. So you're not going to work if you don't have a driver's license. What we do, if you get your basic, if you get your intermediate, your advanced, and your master's, you get, so the city always going to ask that there. Also, if you got a bachelor's degree, we pay you for the bachelor's degree.
Right.
So the city's doing really good there. You don't necessarily put that in that structure there.
That's what I thought, yeah.
We don't have CDL, but it's hard for me to push for a CDL incentive whenever we don't have a single vehicle that requires 4 guys with a CDL. But it's hard for me to push for an incentive for that when we don't even have a vehicle that requires. It's not fair.
And Kimberly, when your girls get certifications? Yes. Okay. And Mary Ann? I'm assuming. What, you give us addition?
Finance is kind of, I don't think you all had ever been encountered with like in-house finance.
True.
To consider those things. So like currently, the certified government finance officer, that's a certification that we get, and it's not on our schedule.
Okay.
But, and that's, that, you know, will be a public.
Was that at your previous employment? Was it on there?
It was put in place.
Okay, okay. So that's something we need to look at then.
Yes, that is
Okay.
correct.
And I think that there are a few others that we've identified in
okay.
looking through our list.
Good.
When we brought the last schedule forward, it was just to put the structure in place on what we currently had in place.
Yeah.
And Mary Ann and I had talked about the finance not being on there, about bringing it back during budget and getting it reassessed.
And make sure that we were looking at any other certifications across the board that pertain.
Yeah.
Where we go, finance one and finance two?
Okay. Awesome. Thank you very much. Did you fly in from Florida?
I did.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for spending your time here.
I'll be back in Texas in 2 weeks, so.
All right, okay. Make sure you eat dinner here tonight. We like your tax dollars.
Stay in city limits.
Council inquiry? All right. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn.
A motion by Ms. Fox.
Second.
Second by Mr. Dawson. We adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. The ayes have, motion carries at 7:02. We will adjourn this meeting. Thank you.
Good deal.
1 hour. Good job, guys.
Yeah.